one thing I meant to say is I'm going to post the link to the Facebook Live in the chats. So please do click on it when it goes in there and share it so that other people can join us as well.
Okay, I think I'm gonna wait maybe a minute for people to just start joining before we begin. Okay, shall we begin?
Yes, why not?
Okay, so I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Amber and I am the blog editor for the Young Fabians. Today's Zoom event is attended by Seema and Paul. Seema is the newly appointed Shadow Employment Minister, former chair of the Fabian Society and chair of the Young Fabians, and she's been an MP since 2011. And then Paul Richards is a former special advisor, chair of the Fabian Society, national secretary of the Young Fabians, author and pamphleteer. So maybe I will hand over, Seema, to you to begin the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Amber, and it's a great pleasure to join Paul and to join you, Adam, and all the Young Fabians who are on the call today. I'm so pleased that we've managed to do this because it takes us right back to when Paul and I did this pamphlet, and I think I'd just become chair of the Young Fabians, and I remember how we put everything into it, all the way we put it together. I spent two afternoons in the CWU's archives looking for photographs. So we really got into the story that for us it was telling about how we were thinking about the big questions, the political philosophy questions of the day, and also that age-old question about the case for socialism and what it means. And I also want to acknowledge how we kind of worked across our networks at the time, the CWU coming to support it, but also the time that it was just a few years into a Labour government. I mean, if ever there was a high point for how the party was received, it was the age of Clinton, Blair, Anthony Giddens, many more. I mean, this was the age of a sort of the rethinking and bringing back, the sort of the questions about the future of socialism. But there was inevitably going to be the kind of tugs of war that we will always experience in the party between one strand of thinking and another. Those ongoing tussles, we will have today as well. And I think one point I'd like to make is that there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer about one outcome versus another in terms of how you might look to try and guide policies that you might deem socialist. And I want to talk about where I think we're now at a turning point where, in a sense, some of the, what may have been branded radical ideas and leftist ideas are almost becoming mainstream because of the way, times have changed and circumstances have changed. And if I take you back to the time as well that we wrote it around the sort of millennium, we were, as well as in government, government is much more complex than theory sometimes suggests, with real choices, and particularly when you're talking about a sort of one society or one nation politics that you're governing by consensus, and that you want to sustain a majority in the electorate. So conversations become considerably more complex because of the responsibility that the government also brings. And the government, sometimes it was attacked for being not left-wing enough. Other times it was probably seen as, still too left-wing. No Labour government is ever going to be kind of exempt from these sort of charges. And at the time, the Young Fabians and the way that you're working today, we were really thinking, how do we reach out and develop our thinking in a different sort of way? And how do we keep ourselves at the forefront of debate about socialism and about social reform, about different types of socialism and where they have their place in our discourse today? So the idea of the pamphlet was really to give that space for the Young Fabians to be able to have a very different debate, because a debate about theory can be very different from a debate about a policy matter like housing or education, and necessarily commands a different way in which you're thinking about ideas, the context within which those ideas were developed, the extent to which they're still relevant today, the extent to which they may move on. And so it was helpful to be having that debate about values as we are doing today, and how we search again today for those to answers to our modern big questions. I think what was positive as well is how the pamphlet was helping to put that question centrally in the Young Fabians and for the Young Fabians, within the sort of Fabian tradition of inquiry, investigation, facts, research, and as well as challenging dogma. I think those things are important, because I do have a belief that if you want to change things, it is important to say, well, look, how were these decisions made? Who was making them? And if I was back in that time, would I have thought the same, or would I think differently? Would I have argued with them? And being free to be challenging about dogma and theory. And so I think what is important is that, and the Fabians haven't done this, accept socialism as one unified, all-encompassing theory, and say that therefore there's a way in which we're saying this is socialism and this is not socialism, but recognize that it's harder to define than that, and recognize that there's got to be debate. There's got to be a debate that allows for the many routes into socialism, both theoretical and practical, but also that we are all on a journey, and how we can unite around our values, how we think about disentangling or questioning ends versus means, how we don't confuse policies as ends in themselves, but actually keep focused on the outcomes. I think as well, we do believe in freedom, and we believe in equality. We believe in a lot of those values around the equal worth of all, around opportunity, and how policies should be tested against those values. And now, I think, as well as 20 years ago, we shouldn't be fixated on policies if times move on, they no longer work. I think we'll also be recognizing as well that policies that might have been seen as too radical in those days may seem very moderate now. And this is where I think the question about what's moderate is often a relative one, because society changes, values change, expectations can change. And that's why I think holding this event is extremely relevant. I want to give a very strong message to the Young Fabians and to others who may not have joined the Fabian Society or any other groups that think about questions deeply, because I want people to really appreciate how important it is to engage in intellectual thinking and debate, to do so at an age when you'll also be forming your political thinking and views, testing those out with a peer group that's there to be challenging as well as supportive in that, because it's important to debate, to read, to think, to write, to have access to the very greatest of today's thinkers, and to not feel that you are in any way unequal to them, that very much you are the future. You are the ones who will be holding the legacy of the thinkers of today and building your own thinkers tomorrow, and you will be the ones whose legacy will be then taken forward by the next generation. So in a sense, it's a kind of opportunity as well as a sort of responsibility that I do see the Young Fabians and other groups like the Young Fabians, but obviously very proud of the Young Fabians, having in our modern dialogue, and the reach that comes with your thinking and ideas, can go much further because of social media than perhaps it did even in the days when I was chair of the Young Fabians. And so Paul might talk, Paul will talk a little bit about socialism and what it is and what we mean by moderate. But I think I want to be a bit challenging, because I actually don't think that label fits too well, because it sounds extremely middle of the road, as if you're not making choices on one side or the other. But actually, when it comes to policies, you have to make choices. There will always be trade-offs, and you will always have to make choices. And what is radical one day can become mainstream the next. And part of that is values-based socialism, and about winning arguments and public opinion. Dogma-based socialism doesn't really do that, and I think it does lend itself to reduced inclusivity and debate and discussion. And I also do want to make this point about diversity, and I want to make this in the context of the times we're in now, Black Lives Matters, and some really critical deep-rooted debates that we have to have about where power lies, about what we really see as equality, how we might kind of rethink how we define our history as well, and what voices we choose to share as we develop that history. Gender and politics is one example of a story that was not really told in the way that we chose to use 2018 to define and redefine the sort of history of women's voices in politics and parliament 100 years on from when women first had the right to vote and to stand in elections. But that took a long time. And for most of 100 years, we still had less than 10% of women in parliament. So I do want to just end with some reflections as well as to why this is incredibly important, and how we need to be defining new thinking to the context of today through a few examples. I want to start with broadband, because we know that this caused some reaction in the election with a broadband policy that was seen as costly and perhaps too ambitious where the country was. But I think it's an example of how, regardless of how it was going to be implemented, the idea of broadband for all and the ambition for that in less than 6 months has turned into a debate with broadband not seen as a luxury, but seen as a necessity. Because when we went through lockdown, you've now got the debate about growing inequality in education, where we knew there was already a disadvantage that was apparent of 4.5 months on average by the time you're 7, and doubles by the time you're 11, and you're 18 months behind your peers if you're from a disadvantaged background on average by the time you're 16 and doing your GCSEs or equivalent. So now we're saying suddenly, as if inequality wasn't there before, the need for broadband as an equalizer to be able to work at home, to be able to access services at home, to be able to be in touch with your relatives and your friends and socialize and have the human flourishing that we so want to see. And I think it's a very interesting example of how a debate has moved on that in one way was ahead of its time, and time has caught up. The question about what means you deliver that by is a separate debate for policy, and that's one in which we should now lead. And because I think this is, the idea of broadband as a utility is now coming from rural Britain as much as it is from the heart of Westminster. I think as well, if we think about the NHS, now the NHS, in my view, sort of had its heyday when in our sort of recent political life, when it was so much part of our story at the time of the Olympics, so much part of our story as a nation, so much part of how we were as a collective, how much we valued the lives and the health of each other, free world-class healthcare at the point of need. We went through a period, in my view, when we've seen a sort of creeping privatization, a dismantling of some of the resilience and the robustness of our NHS. That's now, I think, a sort of consensus view about what's happened. The debates about whether we would see, we would lose leverage through the NHS if we had trade deals that weren't, were done under, more duress because we'd lost leverage, that weren't going to be in the interest of the our long-term values of the NHS. But in an odd way, and I think as a consequence, a byproduct of COVID-19, what I think we've seen is a realization and a redefinition of the NHS and its place in our public life. And the incredulity of Americans to see that our Prime Minister had exactly the same treatment as anybody, wherever they were from and based on their need. And I think that's an extraordinary story of how an institution based on values has stood the test of time, and socialist values, no less, that is now championed also by by the majority of Tories. We've got debates about good work and how we redefine now our thinking around the world of work, what that's going to mean for social security in work and out of work, how we value all our citizens, whether they're able to work or not, in terms of contribution to self-development and to society, how we think about society, and how we think about the decisions that need to be made around allocation of public resources, the new democratic socialist frame that we need to develop for our modern time, and recognize, I think, two other dynamics. The first is, I think there's been some very important writing about this. The national and the local in the next phase are going to be more important than globalization, because of the way countries are thinking about becoming more self-sustaining as a result of lockdown. But that doesn't mean that we're not internationalists. What it does mean is that I think we're redefining how we see internationalism, and also where we've got institutions that perhaps have lost faith and that aren't as fit for purpose now, that have to be reformed. So that institutions like the UN and others that may need that have had some criticism, how do we reform and make them most effective and have the teeth they need for the choices that we need to make today, where we may do things as a collective defined by values, and where we need to win arguments across an international community. And just to finally say as well, how timing is sort of everything in politics. Ideas can be ahead of their time. The NHS and welfare state, and the concepts in which they really became operationalized and implemented and envisaged after the Second World War, were very much in the thinking of Beatrice Webb and other Fabians, as far back as the sort of 1909 in the Minority Report. And so, those ideas carried through from researchers as the baton was passed through history, through Fabian traditions. That's how change has sometimes come about, through thinking and rethinking through different contexts and ages, and how you make the case and how you strike while the iron's hot, how you understand and read the mood, and how you can apply values and ideas to a modern setting. So, I think I'll just finish and then allow Paul to come in with a bit more about the pamphlet. But it was important then for us to be thinking about that conversation while we were in power, because being in power is also about renewal, perhaps more often, because your re-election is always about tomorrow and never about yesterday, and that's one of the sort of cold hard truths of politics. But today we're in a position where there's so much fluctuation, fluctuation in politics that I've never seen, you've never seen, but to experience it has been like being buffeted constantly over the last 3 or 4 years. And so how we now think about a less stable political context, but the idea that election could come any time, but is likely to be 4 years away. How we redefine debates now, how we do that based on values, how we understand and capture the public mood, how we deeply listen to what's going on socially and culturally in society, and how we look for answers to today's problems to create the tomorrow that people need and want. And we do that with credibility in order to see us be in government again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over to Paul, who I believe has some slides.
I do. Hello. Yeah. So that was a characteristically lucid and robust and brilliant introduction to our topic tonight from Seema. Thank you very much indeed. It's always difficult to follow a class act. I'm just going to make a couple of remarks and then I'll switch to the slides. I think as a peg for tonight, our excuse, if you like, was the publication 20 years ago of the pamphlet, The Case for Socialism. By the way, I don't know if you can see that, but we had both Tony Benn on it and Tony Blair on it. They consciously chose an imagery there to show that there is a spectrum of views across the Labour tradition, and that we are a broad church, and that the sort of ethical, values-based socialism could fit into lots of different people's views of what socialism is, which is a massive strength, but also a massive weakness, as I'm going to go on to describe, because I think for the last few years we've been a bit battered by our opponents, both the populist right, but also some of the doctrinal left as well. Just tried to paint us as being rootless and valueless and somehow a pale imitation of something better, or perhaps even red Tories or centrist as a negative. Because we don't have a single doctrinaire view that we all unite around, we don't have a single dogma that we sign up to or a creed, it means that we've all come on this journey from different places and we're all influenced by different things. It's sort of, it's our strength, it's also a weakness in terms of organisation. We can't just, all sign up to the same stuff. Even down to the labels. And so the history of this is quite interesting because the word socialist doesn't appear in our clause 4 until Tony Blair puts it in there in the mid-1990s with the reform clause 4. People in our position of the party would, in other countries, call themselves social democrats. And I do a lot of work with the Party of the European Socialists around Europe, working with social democratic parties. They call themselves that quite happily. But in this country, it's the taint of the SDP and the breakaway of the Gang of Four in the early 80s. So we don't like the term social democrat quite so much. And then we stopped using socialist on its own because of the arrival of the USSR and the undemocratic socialism. So we've got ourselves democratic socialists. I suppose the point I'm making is you have to pick a label, that's you, there isn't a single label for it. And if you want to be a centrist, if you want to be a moderate, you call yourself a social democrat, fine. We'll judge you by your deeds, not the label that you affix to yourself. And so Seema described a political method, which I think is so important with this, is that you disentangle ends and means. You apply values to modern problems, and you don't fixate on this or that policy as though the policy was the credo or the dogma that defines socialism. And if you liberate yourself in that way, if you liberate your mind to thinking, well, here are my values, how can I apply them to the modern world? It's a very exciting mindset, and it's very dynamic, and it allows you to be as radical as you like, because if the policy works and it will have the desired outcome, then that's socialist. And if that means free broadband, great. So it's a clever and very robust way of applying values in each changing circumstance. And if you want me to prove that, then just read some old Labour manifestos, particularly before the war, where their policies were things like an end to compulsory vaccination, abolition of the standing army, attacking Chinese labour, in inverted commas, temperance, banning alcohol. In other words, a whole lot of policies that they thought were terribly, terribly important in their times to address the issues as they saw them, which today are utterly meaningless without any purpose at all. And even just talking about the internet, I remember a Labour Party conference in the mid-90s, it must have been around the time we were thinking about this pamphlet. Tony Blair's big announcement in his leader's speech was that the next Labour government would, and big build-up, drum roll, attach every school in the land to the information superhighway. Now, we didn't quite understand what it was, I don't think, but we were told to clap anyway. And what they meant was having an internet connection in every school. Now, that was the big, dramatic, modernising moment in the speech. Now, laugh at every child in the school has got an internet connection through the smartphone, and times move on. So, policies in each generation may have some application based on values that endure and last and what really matters. With the slides, what I've done is just pick out a few of the quotes from the pamphlet, which I think were either made us look incredibly perspicacious and wise, or just were kind of interesting in their own terms. I hope that's okay. Maybe Amber will tell you the slides are now up. Can you see those?
Well, I think the connection is a bit slow. Would you mind muting and then unmuting yourself to see if that improves the connection?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's much better, thanks.
So if I get the slides up, so Amber, can you see those okay? Those been broadcast? Yep. Can you see me? Can you see the slides?
No, so just bear with me a second.
No. Okay.
I'll switch off video just in case it helps with the data.
Shall I try putting them up again? So all I'm doing is doing a screen share.
I'm not sure why that's not working. Oh,
now?
yeah, it's working now. Great.
My incompetence rather than any other technical reason, I suspect. Okay, I bet that's full screen. So, I mean, Seema made the point that when we wrote this, we were in an incredibly strong position electorally across Europe. 13 out of 15 European countries had socialist governments, and the Labour Party obviously was in power, and yet we still felt it was important to do that, because as this cartoon suggests, this has nothing to do with the pamphlet, but it just shows this from the 50s. It just makes the point that we've been arguing about what socialism is as long as there's been a Labour Party, and indeed long before that as well. You know, there isn't a single answer, and that's one of the great epiphanies, is that you have no answer but your own, really. But we do make the point that even winning elections, as we did back then, it's not the same as winning the battle of ideas, and so that the party in government does need to renew itself ideologically, spiritually, and values-based in order to carry on. So here are some quotes from the pamphlet then. I mean, these are about the attitude towards Labour in government, and we felt very much that there were attacks on that government from the left, from people who'd helped get it elected, but then saw their role as trying to drag it down. And it's just a very strange attitude. I likened it to a gardener trying to get a delicate plant to take root, and then once it started to show some leaves, take a chainsaw to it. And so we should defend our role in government and our you know, what we do in government as well. Socialism is not a creed or a dogma, but a mental framework. As many socialisms as there are socialists, and crucially, not a watered-down version of some other socialism. It's not a halfway point between capitalism and communism. But we made the point that there's no single democratic socialist text, and that those kind of ideological roots can be based to the free market right or religious cults. What do we believe, though? As Seema has outlined, we believe in the equal worth of all humans, and that our socialism is driven by a set of values. And that we're optimistic, that we think the future can be better than the past. The picture of the French Revolution is there to remind us that some of these values are drawn from the Enlightenment, from the French Revolution, and so they sort of predate the Labour Party itself. I just quite like this quote from Keir Hardie: "Socialism does not come by shouting." And it just made the point that you have to do stuff, you have to step up, you have to stand for office, you have to win elections, you have to serve your community in whatever way you think is best. And crucially, of course, we believe in evolution, not revolution. We are not part of the Marxist-Leninist tradition in the Labour Party. We don't believe in an armed workers' revolution. We are rooted in parliamentary democracy and democratic institutions. And the pamphlet said at the time, the small number of Marxists who claimed the collapse of capitalism was around the corner have been waiting in vain. Like Godot, the revolution is always on the way, but never actually arrives. One of our heroes that we looked at in the pamphlet was Tony Crossland. He'll be familiar to Young Fabians, I hope, and he just made the point: the means most suitable to one generation may be wholly irrelevant to the next. And that is true, isn't it? That is borne out by experience. And I just found this picture online, which I just thought was hilarious. So Crossland is seen as the great sort of revisionist thinker, sort of hero of Labour. And I suspect this is either the London School of Economics or maybe Sussex University or something like that, who are organising a demo and a picket of Crossland with the banner "Crossland is a fascist." So this is obviously the International Socialists, the forerunner of the SWP or some such. And the other banner says, "If he's a socialist, the Pope's red." So there you go. We've always had enemies to our left. What is revisionism? Well, it's a permanent process. It's about scrutinising and questioning policies. A political party of blind and mindless loyalty can have no long-term future, we suggested. And there's a nice quote here from Tony Wright, who used to be a Labour MP, but also a Labour intellectual, which makes the point that the values are the enduring reference point by which policy compasses are set. So don't fixate on the policies, but refer to the values. And this quote is from Ignazio Cerrone, who's an Italian political thinker. And he makes a much bigger claim. He says that a system of values can construct a culture, a civilization, a new way of living together. Which is a very bold claim, whereas he contrasts that with socialist theories which can found a school or a system of propaganda only. And again, that's a very strong, bold claim, but I think there is something in that. The values, we talk about liberty, equality, community, Seema's alluded to those. And when we think about disentangling ends and means, I think that one of the examples in the pamphlet was this idea of nationalisation. And I made the point, nationalising state control of things may be the best possible solution. So state-run health service is almost certainly the best way to run it. State-run schools and universities, almost certainly the best way to run it. But nationalisation of itself is not necessarily socialist. And I made the point that fascist governments and conservative governments have nationalised enterprises and companies in different times. We said there that those that today call for nationalisation for the sake of it, as though the state buying up private industries is some kind of panacea to years of underinvestment, have confused ends and means. And this banner, Bring Back British Rail, is just hilarious to anyone that can remember British Rail. And it may well be that the best possible settlement for the rail system is to have total state control, including the track and the stations and the things and the actual franchises running the railway. But that needs to be tested, because just automatically having it in the state control does not necessarily mean, you know, if it were underfunded and being cut, that you've got a better service. And if the goal is to liberate humanity and have a public railway system that allows people to move around and work and see their loved ones, then what's the best way to achieve it? And we need to apply those values in each situation. And so it's not about turning the clock back and just saying that they used to be slightly, it was much better in the 70s, let's make it look like that. That may not be the best thing, or it may be, but that's the discussion that needs to be had. The pamphlet did touch on the technological revolution. I'm quite pleased with myself, I have to say. There's a little bit of foresight here, even though this was 20 years ago. We did identify the fact that new technology is forging a social revolution, and it's every bit as significant as the Industrial Revolution. And we weren't alone in this, I have to say. We're not prophets in our own land, but we did identify this as important, particularly changing patterns of employment. And looking at what at the time was called the no-collar worker, so somebody who's neither blue-collar nor white-collar, moving between job to job, contract to contract, portable portfolio of skills. You know, that's exactly the way the economy has gone. Home working will become increasingly prevalent. Well, that's true for terrible reasons right now, but as a trend also true. And gosh, I wrote this amazing factoid. 15% of the population regularly buying goods over the internet. Imagine that back in the year 2000. I don't know what the number is now, but it must be 80 or 90%, I would think. And that's what the internet looked like in 1999. Internet Explorer 5, and it took about a day to get anywhere. But technology driving change is one of the things that we identified, and that makes the point about values even more important. A couple of quotes just to finish off this section before we open it up to any kind of discussion. Barbara Castle talking about socialism is the quality of human relationships, which is a fantastically non-ideological and non-economist point of view. It's about the way we relate to each other. And then the final one is there's Jacinta Ardern, who is obviously showing that, you know, we are internationalists and we have our ideas are shared by colleagues across the world. And she was accused that by her opponent said, you know, once the stardust has settled, you know, this Labour government in New Zealand will be terrible. And she retorted that the stardust won't settle because none of us should settle. And that's true, isn't it? You know, as democratic socialists, social democrats, we are restless for change. We are hungry and eager for change. We are change makers. And we don't settle. We do keep moving forward because the movement is everything. And that's the constant reapplying of values in each age and each generation to the problems of the age is what keeps us as a political movement, not a monument. And allows us to be relevant and fresh and dynamic in each generation. So there's some of the quotes from the pamphlet. I think that it stands up well, but it doesn't matter what I think, it matters what you think. So happy now, Amber, to open it up to any kind of discussion or anything you may want to add or anything else.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I suppose I'll start off with my own question of what you two think about politics today and how the Overton window has shifted, and what would seem that Brexit, Donald Trump in America have made politics more extreme, and what do you think we can do to bring more moderation back into politics? It seems that everybody is either on one or the other end of an extreme divide.
Yeah, Seema, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think what's so important to be able to do is to start to see when a game is being played, because there's a lot that's out there at the moment about the kind of narrative we're seeing, the kind of extremes that Donald Trump is playing, perhaps using race in a way because it's electorally beneficial. And we've already had, I think, early conversations and evidence-based with what Boris has said and when he's said it. And so when you see culture being used, and the culture war starting to be used as a way to divide in order to win on numbers, I think what people are starting to see and scrutinize is when there's authenticity in that and when there is not. And one of the things I think was so important in the last week was Katie Hopkins being removed from Twitter on the basis of hateful comments. And I think as an example of where extreme language starts to go too far, and there are consequences of language. I think you are seeing, to some extent, a reaction against some of those extremes where people are starting to say, are we being treated authentically? And are we being really valued as citizens? Or are we being played as pawns in somebody else's game? And if so, who is that? And I think those questions become very important when it comes to trust in your politicians, trust in who's going to really benefit from decisions that are being made, trust in whether you're being told the truth, trust in whether it's one decision, one rule for one and one rule for everybody else. That, I think, is a new lens as we go into a new phase, which I think COVID has lent itself to, where we've suddenly been all dependent on each other for our own health. And there's a kind of a way in which a social contract sort of got thrown in to lockdown. And so we don't know where the world is going to go post-COVID. You may have a reaction whereby suddenly everybody wants their freedom back, and COVID very quickly becomes a story of yesterday that people forget in the rush of the new modern world. I think we're going to be in a mix of a sort of hybrid pre and post-COVID realities. What I do think it has done is it's jumped on the reset button, where people have started to reevaluate what's been important, reevaluate who has saved us in this crisis, which hasn't been the wealthy. It has been those on low incomes doing the jobs at the coalface, doing the jobs that have kept our streets clean, doing the jobs that have kept us moving, doing the jobs that have kept us alive. And I think there's a reevaluation that we need to now understand and I think work with in terms of what's really important for people, for our society, that's going to move. I think the phrase has also been from just in time to just in case, where we're going to be more risk averse. So on that reset button, which I think has happened on the climate, it's in climate change, it's happened now on our health service, it's happened now on how we just live our lives. It's happened on globalization and the speed with which the virus traveled the world. It is a reset button now, and politics is going to change. What we don't yet know is by how much.
Yeah, and if I could add, populism as a phenomenon obviously exists in many, many different political systems, but it does share characteristics, and they are broadly a strong leader figure, a sort of distrust towards establishment institutions and organizations, and a sort of us and them, a sort of conspiracy theorist kind of undertone of they're all lying to you, and the mainstream media is against you, and so on, often blaming the other, so whatever the other is in different societies, is allied to that, and a strong strain of misogyny as well. Now, all of that had its high point, I suppose, with the election of Trump and various others around Europe. It's all been challenged by the last few months, because suddenly, we do want to trust scientists, but we do need to know what medicine is telling us to do. We do believe in institutions like the National Health Service to help us get out of this situation. We are starting to doubt whether the leaders are telling the truth and have our best interest at heart when they don't seem to know what they're doing. So sort of reverting back to some of the certainties more conducive to social democracy. So I'm hoping that actually one of the fallouts from this, and Steve's right, we don't know, but one of the fallouts may well be a sort of re-tilting back towards more traditional politics, where that plays into our strengths and our hand. The main thing populists do is try and play emotions versus rationality, and the Fabians are all about rationality, aren't they? That's what we are all about patient investigation, research into the way the world is. And so I hope it's tip back towards that kind of rational enlightenment type politics, and away from the populist, because obviously that will help us.
Thank you for that. That was very illuminating. We've had a question from Matt Dickinson. Where are the greatest examples of socialism in action and why? And could you perhaps give past, present, international or local examples of that? I'll start with Paul.
Sure. I mean, I always say if you want to see socialism, go for a stroll in the park, because a public park is the perfect example of a socialist enterprise. Now, they didn't always exist. There were campaigners that said this space should be open to all. It's paid for by everybody through their taxation. It's owned collectively by all. It's not gated. You don't have to buy your way in. It's not a pass you have to buy. You don't have an individual strip of land. You have a ownership over all of it. And yet it's something which we all can enjoy. And it's so simple and obvious that people don't even think of it, I don't think, as being socialist, and yet it is. The National Health Service similarly stands as a great monument to socialist values in this country. I think the greater equality in societies, particularly the Nordic countries, can give us great impulse to hope as well around the world. So I mean, I would look towards Sweden and Norway and those sort of places where they're not problem-free and there's no nirvana out there, but they do give us clues as to the ways in which progressive economic systems can work to benefit all. About socialism is it never arrives. It's all about the progress towards it. It's all about the journey. It's about the movement. It's not about some sort of New Jerusalem that actually arrived on the doorstep. It's all about the evolutionary change, the inevitability of gradualism, as I think somebody was there.
Thank you. Seema, if you want to.
Look, I think that's a really great question, and I would. I'm going to choose a few examples. I'm going to extend Paul's Parks comment, because I think if you take something like Epping Forest, now Epping Forest was, I think, bequeathed by Queen Victoria and had emergency legislation passed so that it could be there, and managed under a set of rules for her people. And she saved it from sort of being, going to sort of into private hands and sort of being lost for the public forever. And that kind of, welfare of that space and its access for all continues as a sort of principle, and guided by her values in how that happened. And I do think that's important, because human flourishing, it goes much further than having income. It requires access to space and places and experience of well-being. But I also want to extend the kind of thinking, because then there's sort of one choice that's been made in a sort of, when I say in our lifetime, I mean, for people who are alive today that are older than us to remember, which is the founding of the NHS. I mean, really, when you think about it, it's so utterly extraordinary that you sort of had the public permission to buy up all those small kind of local district and sort of, you know, small village hospitals and turn it into a national health service that, you know, for all its creaking and its, you know what's happened over the last 10 years to its resilience, has been able to function as a national system. And then you had a nation applauding it every Thursday evening. I mean, it is extraordinary how quickly, you know, an NHS that was under threat has now become a national priority, and has served our nation in a way that perhaps we never imagined. It has been the most extraordinary service to our nation, and it is owned by all of us through the state. It isn't, you know, it's and that's I think the exceptional thing about how we've managed this system that is now part of our national identity as well. I want to just use a third example, though, which is Finland, and I think the education system there, which is I think a kind of good example. And it's where, you know, in the sort of Scandinavian countries, you've got the least dependence on where you have an education for how well you do. And when you look at international statistics, you know, we're not great on a number of those international statistics against other education systems, because they're still very entrenched inequalities. And even within the state sector, very different ways of running schools and operations. The same quality questions about leadership and innovative thinking have started to happen even in the COVID lockdown time. But the principles that, you know, have been embedded in an education system as it's evolved, I think have been quite important for countries that lead the way on some alternative measures. And I think, again, it lends itself to a question about how do you focus on outcomes for all children in our country? And you get into debates about how do you deliver that, what means and what ends, and we will disagree on, you know, you may disagree on the means. You may have places in which, you know, probably area where I'd be more supportive, which is how, you know, and I've seen this operate with my local schools, how there's got to be greater partnership and contribution from, you know, from private schools into the state sector, rather than abolishing all private schools. But that's my personal view. And, you know, we've seen that in how we've created partnerships with some of the poorer schools in my community with other schools to say you should be, you know, sharing in contribution to how well children from poorer backgrounds are doing. So that, you know, so there are different ways in which you might frame those debates, and ways in which those ideas may also change with time. But the ultimate outcome, that there shouldn't be such a dependence on where you might be and where you might get educated, and in which part of the country or in which school. There shouldn't be that dependence for a child to do well. And if you're focusing, and if you had a real focus, as I think we showed through our early years work under Labour, if you've got a real focus on education outcomes, then you would focus on early years, where there's a real determinant for both your attainment and social mobility. I can contrast that directly with a decision made by this government just a few days ago, where the millions, that 300, was it 350? It went down to 300. I'm not sure, but there was an announcement on Thursday evening for the amount that, I'll just double check that, they're going to invest in our education system to help with catch up. And what they did between 6:30 and 8 o'clock on Thursday night was remove 50 million and remove further education. So if you're 16 in FE, you don't get support. If you're 16 in a school, you do. And early years, from how they were going to fund in this round. And you've got to ask the question about why, if you believe in attainment and you believe in education being important for all children. And you've got to ask the question why, if early years, that is already a struggle, is not getting the attention, because the language development, you know, that's so important early on, goes a huge way in the first 2 or 3 or 4 years of your life to how quickly you'll be able to read. And once and first you learn to read, but then you read to learn, and you haven't learned to read, then you can't read to learn. And so that culture and that situation continues well into people's adult years.
Sorry. So we've got another question from Amy Hall, who is asking, the word socialist can sadly immediately turn people off. How can we show the benefits of socialism when even the word itself is being made so divisive? Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the way you handle that, and you're right, it is a word that has been turned against us and used by our opponents, and they have framed it and defined it as an entirely negative thing. The way you counter that is through deeds, isn't it? It's by what you do. And if you can put forward a policy program based on your values that people find engaging and attractive and practical and popular, then people don't much care what you call it. And if it works and people like it and it's socialist, then so what? If you get bogged down in ideology, then of course you are in trouble, because we could be tainted with that word just as surely. Tony Blair, when he was running for leader, he wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian Society called Socialism, but he defined it as socialism with a little hyphen in the middle. And it was an attempt really to sort of say it's about society and about our relations one with the other, rather than Marxism and Leninism. And it was a sort of fairly laudable attempt to do that. And as I said at the start of this webinar, don't forget, he put the word socialism into clause 4 in the mid-90s, where it wasn't even there before. So I think we have to be careful with labels and show people what we mean. Show rather than tap, I would say.
I think Paul's absolutely right. I think a lot of it comes through showing what you're doing and how you're putting values into practice. But I would also say, this is also about us being confident about our own political identity as a party and our identity individually, because we'll all have slightly different views. That's why we have debate in the Labour Party. Otherwise, if we all agreed, we'd never even have annual conference. Can you imagine that? Because the decisions would be made. Why would you need to debate, and why would you need to vote? And I think just some of those basic structures that we have and how they themselves have come about and developed over time since the very start of the Labour Party has been because we have to have ways in which we mediate how we differ, as much as recognising that the broad church that we're part of is a place in which we're all broadly at home. And it is our home. To me, the Labour Party is like another family. You're never going to agree with everybody all the time. Sometimes you don't agree with many half the time. But the point is, it's like family, and you're not going to. I wouldn't live without it. And it's where you find yourself and your relationships within that. I would say as well, it is for you, each one of you, to define what socialism is to you and to have that as your guiding anchor. And you can take, some of the traditions in the past. Confidence often comes with reading, because it demystifies where ideas have come from and demystifies why people believe what they believe. But you could take, for example, what was in Paul's presentation and Barbara Castle's definition, which is socialism to me is the quality of human relationships. Now, if you take something like that and say, actually, that's kind of what it means to me, or you may have a way in which you think about it differently, then that is your guiding principle, in which if anybody ever asks you that question, you know which kind of part of the socialist tradition you align with more. And it's it is about shades of red, and being confident in that, understanding the history of those ideas, being confident in those historical roots, but also where you might think about applying them if you were solving a problem, if you were a local councillor, or you become an MP, or you're working in policy, whether that's outside of Parliament or inside of Parliament. Even in those roles, you are helping change things in line with a set of values. And I would say sometimes, and I speak to what I was saying about the danger of closing the space for debate and discussion, if too much is led by dogma, doesn't allow for freedom of thought, doesn't allow for challenge. And I think every single Fabian and young Fabian should be able to be confident about thinking where they are on those spectrums, and then taking that standpoint, because at some point that standpoint may be the truth that is spoken that changes a conversation and wins an argument of the day.
Thank you for that. I think we have our final question from Adam. So Adam is asking, have we entered an age of mass movements? The party grew to 500k under Corbyn with hard left elements joining. Now we have seen a huge churn with people leaving, but we have enough people joining to grow it to 600k under Keir. Is the Labour Party now a mass movement for social democrats? And how do we promote social democratic values to members through it?
I mean, I'm a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to this stuff. This is a very heretical view, but I would say that there's no obvious correlation between electoral success and size of membership. And if there was, we would have won the last election. The Tories would have lost it. The Tories won that election with a membership, tiny compared to Labour, and also much, much older, in terms of the averages, and yet still piled up votes in seats that have been Labour for ages. Now, we do need vibrant, lively, active local Labour Party branches, and they should be active in the community, being seen active as councillors and community campaigners and leaders. But I don't much care whether it's 400,000 or 600,000 or 1 million. It doesn't matter that much if the ideas are wrong. So it comes back to being on the right side of the argument as well. And as Boris Johnson showed, if you get the right message that appeals to people in that circumstance, it doesn't matter whether you've got members or not. He won that election without any members. And we had all the members standing around, in seats that we didn't win. So I'm sure you're all going to pile in now and tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think we should fetishize the size of membership quite so much.
Well, I hope that we will massively increase our membership even more. I'd like everyone in the country to be a member of the Labour Party. But I think it is about recognizing as well that being a member of the Labour Party can mean different things to different people. For some, it is just saying, look, I'm just, I've always been Labour in my heart, but now, I feel that the country's got to change. And, I was in quite by chance, I was in the supermarket in Heston yesterday, last night, and somebody stopped me who I've not met before, and said, "Are you the local MP?" And I said yes, and he just talked about how it was nice to have a chat about things and how he felt things now had to change, and we'd seen too much go wrong, and he was a French national but had lived in the country a long time, and just the whole kind of few minutes of socially distanced conversation in a local supermarket, and then when we were in the queue 2 meters apart, I said, "You should join the Labour Party," and he said, "I'll think about it." And part of it is about asking, because it's about inviting people in where they have Labour values, they want to share. And I said, look, your experience and your life is going to be really important to share in the really difficult decisions ahead, and how we're going to think about the kind of society that we want to be. Obviously an interesting conversation to have while you're buying milk and yogurt and vegetables, but it was exactly as it was. And some will go on to become more active in terms of taking part in campaigning activities. Some of those will go on to stand for election, and this is the pathway into power. This, the act of joining a political party for many is a very, very big deal, especially if they've not been a part of a political culture, because it's about putting your kind of heart on your sleeve. And once you become a member, whether you're kind of open about it or not, because men for work or other reasons can't be as active or visibly active as they would like, you kind of become an ambassador for the party in your family and in your community because you've made an active choice. And so I respect everybody that's joined a political party. And I think in our party, there will be, there has been some churn. I think that's right. And there will be churn again in the future. But what it does show is a statement of commitment to what the Labour Party is standing for and is doing, and its responsibility in today's Britain. And in my view, a tremendous, I hope that we see that membership increasing because there's a tremendous seriousness in terms of what we've got to do and what the country needs from a strong opposition that wants to be ready for power as well. So I don't think we should expect it to mean that there will be hundreds of local members at every local rally in every community, because that isn't necessarily how the party works. I do hope it means that people will get much more involved in things like national policy forums, where we're already getting 100, 200 people turning up and oversubscribing Zoom events, with policy commissions that have started. I do hope it will be an open party that's reaching out much more. And I do hope it will be a party in which some of the cultures of local parties that haven't been as inviting when you turn up to your first meeting will start to change, because new people bringing their hopes and aspirations and their real life stories will be the roots of policy ideas that can come forward, as well as culture change in the party. And hopefully, if we are, the example we want to set, culture change and engagement and really good politics in this country again.
Thank you. We have a question from Emma, who's asked, in the last election, many former Labour voter Red Wall seats rejected Corbyn's brand of socialism. When she spoke to former Labour members and councillors in the Midlands, they said they no longer identified with the aims or the aspirations of the party. Under a new leadership, how do you think Labour should communicate its brand of aspirational socialism to voters in these former Labour strongholds in light of the levelling up agenda and the COVID crisis?
I think, one of the ways to answer that is to have the discussion we're having now, which is about values rather than policies. I think one of the reasons we lost some of those voters, I think, in the seats that you described, it wasn't just in the north of England, it was in Wales and Scotland, obviously, was that there was a sense that the Labour Party being presented in that election didn't chime with the values of Labour voters. And hitherto Labour voting communities in some of those seats, and the values had become disconnected. And that Labour was representing a sort of a different tradition, saying something different to what they were holding dear themselves. So I think part of the role is to reconnect the values and the policies, and then the projection and campaigning and all that through the things we do and say. I think, Keir Starmer's made a good start with this, and he obviously, I think he has Labour values in that sense. How he then chooses to project those, we'll wait and see. But that's one way to get towards answering the question, I think, is that you have to show what you mean. If you're seen to be coming from an alien tradition outside of the Labour Party and espousing a kind of politics that people don't really feel comfortable with, then they won't vote for you. They have a choice and they won't do it.
I'd make a couple of points to that extremely good question that goes to the heart of how we've got to begin our journey back. I think the first thing is about listening before you tell, because listening and how we think about relationships, relationship-based politics, relationships between politics and people, relationships between people and people, relationships between people and institutions and public services, relationships between people at work. Relationships are so important for how we think about how we design policy, and we think about how we design the world. We've got the relationship between the North and the South to think about, because quite a lot of what is kind of a cultural point has been the way in which seats have, and areas, not seats necessarily, but areas have been and have felt left behind through globalization that created wealth for those in, more in London and the South, and those who travelled to London and the South as a place, not just not people, but places, where wealth begets wealth, and resources beget wealth, and so where resources haven't gone in as much, and I think that divide has grown, particularly since the dropping of the RDAs by this government that was part of an economic sort of regional strategy. I think what you've seen is a reduced means of levelling up, if you want to use that word, which means that how you might even start to level up is a very complex question. And I think what is likely to be, a challenge for the government is that where they've promised levelling up, and yet they seem to have taken away the means through which levelling up might occur, are they bold enough to be making the big calls and the big investments in the interests of local people and communities, rather than in the interests of those who stand to make the most from those ventures? And I think they will get caught out, because as a party they have a contradiction between what they say and what their values actually result in. So I think for us, we've got to really be prepared to put aside assumptions. We've got to be prepared to be listening, which is why the round tables rather than the town halls that Keir has been doing. I think we've read about them in Southampton and other places, but they've been going on a long time. The events that MPs are doing in their own areas, the events that MPs, the front bench are doing across the country. This has got to be about listening first and foremost, because one of the first things in rebuilding a broken relationship is actually listening. So I would say that has got to come first, and it's going to be a long journey, not just to listen, but to understand what that starts to mean and how it starts to maybe challenge where we think we've got the answers already. The truth is that we're about 4 years away from the next manifesto, unless anything changes in politics again. So we've got to take the time to understand, to be moving with, to be recognizing public opinion, and to be then starting to lead public opinion as trust and credibility grows. So my view is we've made the right start in that, but it is a journey. There is a cultural gap as well. We've got to recognize where the relationships need to be rebuilt between parts of the country, between our politics and the country. And it's going to take every single part and every single muscle of the Labour Party to do that across England, Scotland and Wales particularly, and with Northern Ireland, if we're actually to see and get through this next 4 years as a union still, because that cannot be taken for granted either, and with a base that's going to vote Labour in sufficient numbers for us to have the numbers to be in government.
Thank you both for those interesting answers. We've had a question from Mahmoud, who is asking, some people in the Labour Party seem to think that socialism means supporting and admiring regimes that call themselves socialists, like Venezuela and Cuba. Is there a place for them in the Labour Party? Should we include them in our broad church and try and change their views, or should we show them the door?
I think it depends on why they support Cuba and Venezuela, because we can see pretty plainly, if you apply the methodology that we've talked about all evening of values applied to problems in each generation, then there's very little outcomes in those countries that you can see as being values-based as we would see them, and being therefore socialist, and they're authoritarian regimes, they're all problems with trade unions, minority rights, all things that we understand. But if this sort of hypothetical person that you're arguing with in your local party about Venezuela or Cuba or whatever, if they are motivated by a false belief that somehow that's the good way to have socialism. I think it's legitimate to engage with them and explain patiently with them. If, on the other hand, they support in those places because they're Marxist-Leninists and it's an ideological choice for them, then I think there's a different question to be had. You know, we are not Marxists and we are not Leninists. I advise everyone to go away and read Marx and read Lenin and understand why we're not Marxists and not Leninists, because that's not part of our tradition. It's not cool to have a hammer and sickle on your Twitter bio, or to, you know, to claim to be a fan of Lenin or Trotsky or anybody else, because that's not who we are. So I think that's then a conversation about people in the party who shouldn't be, who do belong in other political institutions, because they do more accurately reflect their own views. But I do it on a case by case. But the most important thing is to read and learn and be confident of your own politics, to understand why it is these people are wrong, and to be able to have that friendly, comradely debate and discussion, and try and persuade people. Seema used the word journey earlier. Don't forget, you know, everyone is on a journey, particularly young people, you know, can be beguiled by easy answers and simplistic slogans, and then they realize through experience that, you know, our politics is a better answer, and they can end up in a much better place. But if we just attack them and denounce them, they'll stay where they are. So, you know, we can help people on that journey, we can guide people, we can hold their hand as they come through it and out the other side, and therefore the role of comradely debate becomes more important than ever in that circumstance.
I think comradely debate is a good place to be, and I think what I would say is that the Fabian tradition of reading and of testing ideas, because at the end of the day, politics is called political science for a reason, and it is good to test what you see. It is good to test whether what's delivered is what it was intended to deliver. It's the heart of how you do scrutiny and you know, hold governments accountable. And I think that, you know, what I hope we're moving to is a greater age of authenticity again, where we're challenging what we're being told if there is evidence to the contrary. And I would hold that to, you know, how people hold up forms of socialism and whether they hold them up to be the answer. I think the other side of this is that every nation is going to have something that they probably do better than others within the context in which they are, with their history and with their cultures. And there is absolutely no harm in learning from what may work. I want to say, would that work in our context or wouldn't it? Because, you know, histories, traditions and politics can be completely different. But you might say, for those citizens in that country, this part of how it works is better for them than what happens in our country. And so there's no harm in fact, it's actually the opposite. I would say it actually should be necessary for us to say, if we're ambitious for our country, if we're ambitious for every citizen, educationally, in terms of employment, in terms of well-being, in terms of support, if you know, if they have you know, a disability, if we're ambition for every generation, for intergenerations, for people to not be lonely and feel that society cares. You know, we will have ambitions for our health service, you know, for being at the forefront of new technology and changing the world for the better. You know, that if we're ambitious for people, we should challenge ourselves always to say, are we the best in class? And if not, where do we learn from? And that's part of always looking for how you improve, how you revise. And I would probably just say, you know, one other country. Look, you know, it's not surprising that every time I think about, you know, where's the leading socialist country now, we all look to New Zealand. You know, and it's not just me. You know, it's leading professors and academics and studiers of leading politicians around the world. You know, who are they picking? Boris, Trump, Keir, and Jacinda. So, you know, I think it's worth saying that, you know, as you know, for a woman politician who spent time as well in the British Labour Party, you know, who's showing how to do things differently, is a real act to follow. And I think even though New Zealand's a much smaller nation, actually how you do things and what impact it has on the lives of your citizens we can always be learning, no matter how small or big the country.
Thank you. I think that's all of the questions. So I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to Seema and Paul for joining us today on what was a really, really interesting discussion. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your considered and thoughtful answers.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good luck.